Hey guys, welcome to another great episode of Retrocollecting 101. I'm your host, Mark Flores, and tonight's topics are Wii and PS3 hidden gems, and I have another additional segment entitled When Retro Gaming Actually Became Popular. Keep in mind the Wii and the PS3 I consider that are consoles and games that you need to look out for now. The Nintendo Wii games are staying cheap for now, but not for long. Keep in mind that the Nintendo Wii actually sold 101 million units. The Nintendo Wii, when it came out in 2006, actually sold units like gangbusters. It actually appealed to the family audience. So a lot more titles based around the family and based around kids actually became more profitable and popular. When it was released, you can imagine for every unit that was sold, at least 3 or 4 games were attached to each console. So that equals out to about 400 million games, 400 million copies of games that are actually ready for the picking. So I want to actually go into that, and with the PS3 as well. So I'm glad you're tuning in. But let's get the commercials out of the way. This episode of Retro Collecting 101 is brought to you by Game Swappers. Game Swappers, buy, sell, and trade your retro games and next-gen consoles. That's PS4 and Xbox One. You could come into contact with Game Swappers via Instagram at GAMESWAPPERS. That's GAMESWAPPERS. Game Swappers, buy, sell, and trade. Keep in mind, guys, that if you do share any which one of my podcasts, that's Retro Collecting 101, my wrestling podcast, pay-per-review wrestling podcast, or the very hilarious current event show, the Mark and Andre show, you'll be able to get 10% off towards your retro game purchases at Game Swappers, or 10% more towards your trade-ins. The only thing you have to do is just share the link to my show via Instagram, via Facebook, any means of social media, and just let me know, and I'll make sure you get your 10% off. But anyway, back onto the Nintendo Wii. I wanted to let you guys know is that based on the success of the Nintendo Wii, a good example of this same success can be attributed to DVD sales. Now, this is why DVD sales were so profitable during this time around when the PS2 and the Xbox was around, because when they initially started these DVD sales, you had more accessibility to a DVD player. The PS2 and the Xbox were pioneers in their right with being able to be the first to play DVDs. I use that example because this is the same way that the Wii U games became popular as well. Based on the units that they sold, back to my previous example, you were able to assume that 3 or 4 games were attached to each console. Same thing with the DVD player. Many outlets of playing DVDs, whether you have a DVD player, an Xbox, or a PS3, PS2, what have you, you could say that about 10 DVDs went with those consoles or went with the player themselves. So you can pretty much assume in the same light as the Wii that many copies are to be held and to be found within thrift stores, within retro gaming stores, or within yard sales and the like. Now I'm going to tell you which games you need to look out for and what general rules on which games you should look out for as well. The reason for this specific topic was many. I get asked a lot, what certain consoles do I look out for? But in this time of age, you need to look out for the newer disc-based consoles and games. As of right now, it's not really wise to necessarily look for the Nintendo 64 games, to look for the Sega Genesis games, and to look for all the older games. As of right now, since retro gaming has actually become ever so popular, it's actually very unlikely to find these games nowadays in the wild. This isn't a final statement, but a lot of people still find games here and there, but to encourage you to not look out for those solely, it's very unlikely that you'll find those nowadays. Just because, in respects to the Nintendo 64, it was released in 1996. That's nearing almost 30 years ago, coming this decade. So it's kind of not wise to be looking at it from that point of view. So you need to base yourself on this rule now, is that the Nintendo 64, the PlayStation 1, and the Sega Genesis are now the 8-bit Nintendo of our era. Is as of an example would be, these games aren't going to be really easy to find now. Like I said, there are exceptions to this rule that you could probably find them here and there, but what I want to get to is that you need to focus on the newer disc-based games now, just because you're not going to find the other mentioned games nowadays anymore. Video games always come around this full circle that I like to call that I like to title like this. It goes brand new. You buy the game brand new. Then trade in, because you want to trade it in for something else, probably a new console or a new game for that console as well. So you go brand new, trade in, nostalgic regret. You go back and you attribute your childhood memories to the console that you had, and then you want to get that console and the games again. So that comes the nostalgic regret. And then you have repurchase. You purchase all the games that you had when you were a little kid, and so goes the circle. The circle is now eclipsing the GameCube and now eclipsing the Wii U. So now from the Wii U and the PS3 and the GameCube, we're now going to see another full circle come around where people have the nostalgic regret for these games, and now they want to repurchase them. Once again, it goes like this. It goes brand new, trade-in, nostalgic regret, and repurchase. Those are the terms I like to reaffirm to people that that's exactly how retro gaming goes, and it goes really much in that pretty much into that order, just because that's how retro gaming goes back. Goes with when I started retro gaming, I wanted to play the Nintendo 64 games that I had when I was little. So it goes with example of me and a lot of people I've heard. I mean, every time I'm at Game Swappers, there's countless people that always say, "Man, I want this game because I used to play it when I was little." It goes just like that. So for the Nintendo Wii, there's a ton of games for this console. So be sure you find the games in every crevice of yard sales, thrift stores, or even rummage sales. So even in some retro game stores, you could probably find them displayed out, and you could probably find a good price for one game that you were looking for. These games that I'm going to mention are kind of steadily climbing in price for now. They still go for about some of them still go for as little as $10 to about $100. The first one I mentioned is Fritz Chest. Fritz Chest goes for about, I think it was like $80 to $100 complete. Me and My Horse, Riding for Gold. Speed Racer, the video game. Lost in Shadow, and Sin and Punishment. Those games are games that I recommend that you find, wherever you can find video games, because the prices on those games are steadily climbing because, some didn't some had limited release, some are very popular, some were very popular at the time, and now people are getting the nostalgic regret for them, and they want to purchase them again. So these games are steadily climbing as of May 17th, 2016, so common sense should advise you to find these games and to make sure you keep them for the time being. Make sure, the price on those games actually rise up as you have them. The games I could recommend personally in this group are Lost in Shadow and Speed Racer, the video game. Lost in Shadow is a platformer puzzle game where your character's shadow is traversing the foreground of the world. Picture Peter Pan's shadow going in about the background. So instead of the main character, you actually are playing as the shadow of the main character, because as the story went in Lost in Shadow is that the character actually loses his shadow and his shadow has to find himself. So the shadow is traversing these worlds, and he's not actually traversing the actual platforms themselves, but he's actually traversing the backgrounds, the shadow of the platforms in that game. It's pretty much the most unique platformer on the console. I haven't seen anything like this in a long time where such a unique trait for a game has been displayed. So that's one game I really want to recommend to people, because if you look up the gameplay of Lost in Shadow, it's actually really incredible. So that's one game I actually recommend to people, because the more people know about this game, the more likely it'll actually become a more very popular, more expensive game as well. Speed Racer, the video game, is similar to F-Zero. The best thing about this game, Speed Racer, the video game, is that all the characters from the Speed Racer anime are all on here. Trixie, Speed Racer, Racer X, Speed's dad, Spritle is also in there as well. So it's actually a really good, cool game for all the people that enjoyed Speed Racer growing up, and to people that actually want a lower price F-Zero clone kind of game. You know, you go outrageous speeds, and one thing that actually separates it from F-Zero is that you're actually able to front flip across and in front of your people that you're racing. So it actually gets kind of teeters along the line of how F-Zero did combat racing, but it's a little bit different because you're actually able to do a few more things that are different than that of F-Zero. So those are a few games I do recommend for the Nintendo Wii to actually pick up. And then I want to actually mention 2 random titles from the GameCube that are mispriced everywhere I've seen it. The Nintendo GameCube's kind of teetering on the edge of games that are pretty much all taken up from resellers and from retro video game stores. But you could probably still find these 2 that I mentioned out in the wild, probably at like a thrift store or probably at a yard sale as well. NCAA Basketball 2K3 and Disney's Sports Basketball. NCAA Basketball goes for about $100 plus, and with Disney and Disney's Sports Basketball goes for about $70 respectively as well. The reason NCAA Basketball goes for about that price is because it was such a crappy basketball game that it was actually pulled off the shelves, and the remaining copies were actually the ones that are most sought after because of the recall on that game. Disney Sports Basketball is your typical animated basketball kind of game, like in the regards to like how Space Jam had the PS1 game, but Disney Sports Basketball actually is a very uncommon title, so that's why it goes still complete for about $70. The GameCube still has some life in regards to them being found in the wild, but the time is running out, so you got to make sure and double check to see if the inconspicuous titles that I've mentioned you can find, and you just got to make sure you find them and that they're worth more than what you paid for. That's all I can recommend as far as that goes for the GameCube and the Nintendo Wii as well. Just to bring up the point again, you guys got to make sure to find these games now, just because from what I'm going to mention in my next segment, when I actually was able to compile data and actually find out when exactly retro gaming became popular, I was actually able to come up with some data, but that goes later on in this broadcast that I have. But what I want to actually re-educate you guys on is that you have to focus on these consoles now, just because as soon as you find them, you could probably still find a few of them sealed. You could probably still find them for a decent price at yard sales. So as long as you're able to get these games now before the prices on them go up, then you can, keep them for a little bit and then do what you want to, whether you want to keep them or resell them for a higher markup, just because they've aged in value, because the nostalgic regret comes available to you. So you'll be able to capitalize on that when they actually become a little bit more valuable. The PlayStation 3, speaking of the PlayStation 3, I'm going to mention the hidden gems in a bit, but the PlayStation 3's journey has a very similar journey to that of the Nintendo Wii. Both were released at relatively the same time. Like the Wii, both sold a generous amounts of units. So with that being said, here are some games that I do recommend to you, and some that are actually worth their value now. There's a game from the from the company Natsumi called Africa. Africa is a safari photography game and is still going for about $50 complete. It's very cool to play. I've seen some of the gameplay, and what I can assess from seeing this gameplay is that It's a safari-based photography game. So you go out into the African savannah and you play this character who's a photographer. You go out taking all these photos of various animals in different situations. There's 100+ missions in which you actually are able to catch these hippos or these various other animals in certain situations. For example, one mission you have to catch a hippopotamus yawning. So those varieties of missions actually go randomly. Like I don't know, there's probably a mission where you have to take a photo of a lion roaring, something of that nature. Like I was getting to, it's still a very cool game to play, but it might carry more value financially if you were able to resell it if you find it somewhere for cheap. One that might be a little more easier to grab now is another game I do recommend for people to grab is Marvel vs. Capcom 3, the Ultimate Edition. The complete price is still going for about $20 to $30, but with the rumor going around the Capcom mill is that this game is actually being they actually stopped production on this game entirely. So this game actually came after the first Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So this game actually provides you a lot more new characters. So in respect to Marvel vs. Capcom 2, this same game right here is probably going to go for that same amount. It's probably going to hold that same prestige as being the final Marvel vs. Capcom 3 game that you'll need, and the most complete one out of the bunch. So that's another game I do recommend for you to find out in the wild. You could probably find it because people are still giving up those games, here and there. People are just giving them away, probably like at thrift stores or yard sales and what have you. So you'll probably be able to find those games because those games are really inconspicuous to look at. And in respects to the Wii U, into the Wii, as I mentioned, is that most of these rare titles don't look like your average rare game. Like they don't look like your franchise holders like the Super Nintendo had or the Sega Genesis. So, Africa has a photo of a zebra in the background of an African safari. Marvel vs. Capcom 3, the Ultimate Edition, just has a bunch of the characters from Marvel vs. Capcom 3 in it, plus a couple of new characters. These don't look like these don't look like rare titles. These look like average titles. Like Fritz Chess just has a picture of like a rook and a pawn on it, and the rest of a background of a chess set. So you have to make sure that you do your due diligence and make sure that you actually look up these prices and make sure that you're actually coming up on a good copy of a game instead of you just passing up a Fritz chest or a Me and My Horse. You got to make sure to look these up, because even under the stereotype that sports titles aren't worth anything, there's actually, you actually contradict yourself, because now for the GameCube you have to look out for NCAA Basketball 2K3. So, and Disney Sports Basketball. So you have to look up for those as well. So you have to make sure to not just pass up these games as if they weren't popular or as if they weren't actually good for you. They'll actually, be very beneficial, because the more you actually look into the rare titles, the more of an edge you'll have against people looking, the more you'll have an advantage of people looking out for them in the wild. You'll be able to actually look and grab them a lot quicker than people that are uneducated. So, off to the next one for the PS3. There's another one I do recommend to grab, just because of, it kind of blends on the avenues of being actually rare and actually sought after and actually being good to play. Godfather: The Dawn's Edition. This is pretty much your typical open world sandbox game set in the 1940s. EA Games, the developer, decided to have you as the character that has a storyline that nearly reflects the life of Vito Corleone, like in the Godfather movies. But this timeline to you is very unique to yours. You'll still be able to do typical mobster things like bribes, extortions, and carjackings, but it actually brings a unique perspective to the typical GTA sandbox blueprint. I've actually seen my little brother play this a few times when he actually was able to play the PS3, and he actually enjoyed it. He actually played it more times than he had a GTA 4 when it came out. So, from what I've seen, it's actually from the gameplay that I've actually seen, it actually looks very nice. The graphics look very good, especially for an EA games. Those are the same guys that actually gave you Black for the PS2, which is another game that's actually going up in price, but not that much for now. I think it's actually hit its peak because it was actually released in 2006. So it's about 10 years and the price hasn't really climbed up that high to the point where you need to actually look out for it. It's actually remained quite stagnant for a game that's going for about $10 complete online. But these games that I've mentioned are a few to look out for. So be sure to always search and do your homework. Trust your instincts as far as game purchases. If you kind of need to do a double take on a game, that's your mind telling you that you need to actually look it up. So make sure you have your price chart app available to look it up. And make sure you compare prices to that if you're in a game store to make sure that you're actually on the right track when it comes to purchasing these games that are more valuable than others. More than likely, the price on these games will go up eventually, but that's not that's not going true for all the games. Some of them might drop, some of them may or may not go up. So it's not really a guarantee, and I do not guarantee it. So that's the ones I want to recommend to you. So just remember that, and you'll have a better perspective on these games. I mean, the general rules to look out for is that always look up the inconspicuous titles, kind of like how I mentioned with Fritz Chest and a few of the other games for the Wii U. The Wii. The Wii had a massive library, so it's very, you'll be very tempted to actually pass by all these games and not look them up. But it'll be in your best interest to actually look them up because who knows, you might be passing by a very valuable game that someone else might pick up because they're a little more patient than you are in picking them up. But that is what I want to say as far as a few of the games that you need to look out for in the coming years, because these are the consoles that you need to be focusing on now. So, before I go into my last segment, which is titled, "Is there a reasonable time to pinpoint when collecting retro games became popular?" Well, that's actually the question, but I'll actually be able to pinpoint that when I mention it right now. But let me get the last commercial spot out the way. That this episode of Retro Collecting 101 has been brought to you by Game Swappers. Game Swappers, buy, sell, and trade your retro games and next-gen consoles. That's Xbox One and PS4. You could come into contact with Game Swappers via Instagram at GAMESWAPPERS. That's GAMESWAPPERS. Game Swappers, buy, sell, and trade. Keep in mind, guys, that if you do share any which one of my 3 podcasts, whether it's Retro Collecting 101, whether it's Pay-Per-View Wrestling Podcast, or whether it's the Current Event Show, the Mark and Andre Show, if you ever share one of those three shows via Instagram, via Facebook, bring it to my attention or bring it to Game Swapper's attention. Take a screenshot, and you'll be able to get 10% off towards your retro games, or you'll be able to get 10% more towards your retro game trade-ins. It's a good deal. It helps me out, and it helps Game Swappers out, and it helps you out at the end of the day. At the end of the day as well. So just make sure you help me out and do that, and it'll be greatly appreciated, and you'll actually be rewarded for it. So the question that the topic that I was able to come up with as I was looking up this other stuff for the Wii and the PlayStation 3, I was able to actually come to the conclusion that there is actually a point in time where you can actually find out when retro collecting became popular. I was looking up all the. I was actually doing some research with this segment, and I was just simply looking up some of the million seller titles online when in regards to the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, and the Nintendo 64, and I compiled all the figures, and I actually came to the conclusion that during the winter of 2014 and the spring of 2015. most franchise title games rose up to an average of about 25 to 35%. This was a spike. This is a spike in comparison to some games that are average below, like, sports games. And what I mean by franchise titles, I'm talking about in regards to the Nintendo 64. You only talk about really pretty much 5 games. You talk about Super Mario 64, Mario Kart, Zelda Majora's Mask, Zelda Ocarina of Time, and Star Fox 64. Those are pretty much the franchise titles when it comes to the Nintendo 64. Those 5 games are pretty much in the top 10 of the top 10 selling most selling games of all time in regards to the Nintendo 64. In regards to the Super Nintendo, we're talking your Super Mario World, your Super Castlevania 4s, Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World. These games during the winter of 2014 and the spring of 2015 shot 25 to 35%. This isn't a coincidence, because I saw about 10 to 25 titles that did the same thing. The major consensus, based on the popularity of these games and based on the actual statistical figures of them rising that much, it comes to no surprise that this is actually the point of when retro gaming actually became popular. This isn't just some half-assed assumption. This is actual data from the most popular games of that era, and the actual figures of how much they cost from the winter of 2014 to the spring of 2015. And at this point, that price from the winter of 2014, that price that was given to me based on actual averages, has never gotten below that price. The price of that game has not gotten below that price since then. It has risen. So by that, these games are actually rising up to points where these games are getting pretty much out of hand as far as a price figure goes. Super Smash Brothers 2 years ago was $25. Now it's running upwards about $55 to $60. And that spike was actually, here, I have the numbers as well. I can actually give you the numbers for some of the games that I've actually seen. So I have Mega Man for the NES. The average on April 2014 was $40. And the average on April 2015, that's a year in time, was $68.96. Castlevania for the NES was $15 in April 2014. In April 2015, that was actually changed to about $22. Super Mario 64, April 2014, $13. April 2015, $25. Super Smash Brothers, April 2014, $39. April 2015, $48. And now, coming up in about May 2016, this price has risen from $50 to $60. Super Smash Brothers for the Nintendo 64 is pretty much the flagship game, to where you can actually attribute your actual, popularity of the console, because this game is actually still going on strong in the iterations of the GameCube, the Wii, and the Wii U. So this title actually holds some prestige over these other ones, because it's still an actual cool game to play, because it still has the similar characteristics to the games that came after it. From this point, all of the games I've mentioned are just a few examples I have to give you. I didn't want to discuss the price hikes on the rare games, because those games would have rose the averages up for the whole experiment. Keep in mind, this is like your DuckTales 2, this is your Fire and Ices, these are your super rare games, your Sculptor's Cut. If I would have figured in those averages, because those differentials from a year to now would have rose up from between about $50 to $100, and that would have actually messed up my averages. So I've actually kept it kind of on the outlines of kind of rare games, but not that rare. Games you can actually get out in the wild still, possibly, but it's actually, when I was actually looking at these numbers, you can actually see that these spikes actually happen within April. From the spring of 2014 to the spring of 2015, you actually see these numbers spike up 25 to 35% on the major titles. So even with in regards to sports games, I remember Major League Baseball featuring Ken Griffey Jr. was a $3 common game. But now, since I've seen the price rise up on it to $5, I mean, that goes to show you that even with the rise in price of these popular games, that actually drives up the price on these other games, because a typical customer would go like this. Oh man, I really like Super Smash Brothers. I'm going to get that. Oh wait, is that Ken Griffey Jr. featuring, is that Major League Baseball featuring Ken Griffey Jr.? Is that WCW versus NWO World Tour? Is that WCW versus NWO Revenge? Is that WrestleMania 2? What I'm going on is these examples of popular sports games that people still like to get because they're fun to play. But they're made in such mass quantities that, people are able to get them a lot more than they're able to get these franchise titles like your Super Mario 64s or your Super Smash Brothers. So to reiterate, at the point of April 2015, the prices for these games have never fell and are steadily climbing. So it's safe to conclude that by these numbers, the most popular games at the time and a timeline from a year and to now, it's safe to assume that these cartridge-based games and these other games and retro gaming in general has become ever so popular within the actual masses. And this isn't just some thing to say. I mean, I've actually was able to compile the data for it. So, so the good thing about this is actually we have a set point in time, so we can actually record a time and place to when retro gaming actually became popular. That goes good for the people selling the games, but that really kind of doesn't go well for the people buying the games now. So just be lucky, those out in the retro collective community, that you've actually started your collections about, like me, 3 or 4 years ago. So just be happy about that. But I kind of want to close out on this final statement. To bring light into my 2 segments, I want to tell you guys that make sure you start collecting for the Wii and for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 now. Because these games, like the games before, like the consoles before, these games will still rise up in price because people still want to go for that retro game full circle. When it became brand new, people wanted it. So, but when it became old during that time, like about 3 or 4 years in, they wanted to trade it in either for another console or for another game of that, another game within that console. But then comes nostalgic regret, where people wanted the games that they had when they were a kid. And then they end up repurchasing the console and the games, and then thus starts the love for the retro gaming. This isn't, tried and true, or this isn't like a final statement on most people, but based on what we've seen now, where retro gaming actually has become more popular, you might have to, hold on to some of those games for a little bit longer, because the prices on these might grow, because as the supply dwindles, the demand goes up, and when the demand goes up, the prices go up. So just be sure to keep those figures in. Just keep in mind that you need to start hunting a little bit with with more ferocity when it comes to the Wii and when it comes to the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. So that's what I wanted to get up with you guys, and you guys. I wanted to thank you guys for actually tuning in to Retro Collecting 101. You guys have a good night. Thank you.